Welcome everyone to Diabetes Canada's 2019 Type 2 webinar series. My name is Janeni Jude and I will be your host today. We are delighted that you are able to join us today for the webinar entitled Staying Safe While Sick and Living with Type 2 Diabetes. To start off, I would like to draw your attention to the survey below the video. In order to best serve your needs, we kindly ask that you provide us with your input by completing this short survey towards the end of the presentation. We thank you in advance for your input. Today's presentation will be about 25 to 30 minutes in length. We would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor. This webinar is presented by Sanofi Pasteur. Now I would like to welcome our speaker, Susie Jin, and thank her for joining us today. Before turning it over to Susie, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. Susie is a community pharmacist, certified diabetes educator, and certified fitter of compression therapy. She is a chapter author for Diabetes Canada 2018 Clinical Practice Guidelines, a key message lead for Diabetes Canada Dissemination and Implementation Committee of the 2013 and 2018 Clinical Practice Guidelines, and has written best practice recommendations for Wounds Canada. Recently, Susie contributes on committees for Health Quality Ontario, including the Diabetes Quality Standard Advisory Committee. While Susie practices diabetes education in a variety of practice settings, including primary care offices, diabetes education centers, and in her community pharmacy, she is most excited about this opportunity to share her knowledge with you through diabetes education in the form of a webinar. So without further ado, I present to you Susie Jin.
Thanks, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, so thank you for joining me for our webinar on staying safe while sick. As Jen had said, this is part of the webinar series for individuals living with type 2 diabetes, but many other concepts actually apply for people also with type 1 diabetes. So, it's something to consider that this could actually be speaking to somebody equally who has type 1 diabetes. Okay, so let's get started. What I like to do is put this in context of the whole guideline dissemination strategy. So really, what I'd like you to do is I invite you to follow along, use your phone or use your computer, and open up guidelines.diabetes.ca. So when you go to visit that website, you're going to see this screen is going to appear. And today's presentation is on staying safe while you're sick. And you're going to see on the left-hand side you'll see the key messages there. And what I like about putting this staying safe while sick within the grand scheme of things is that hopefully you'll be able to appreciate everything else, all the tons of tools and resources that are available to you. So for example, if I want to know how can I reduce my risk of diabetes complications, well, I can click on that the button there on reducing my risk of diabetes complications, and a whole bunch of tools and resources will open. You'll see there's some that are designed for the healthcare provider, but we also have several patient tools. And so if I wanted to know what do I need to do to reduce my risk of complications, well, at any time, take your time, go through those, and any questions you have, take those to your healthcare provider and find out that's the why. Why do I need to do this? It's because essentially if I can check off all those boxes and do all this and make sure I meet my screening and make sure I get my targets, then I have successfully reduced my risk of developing complications as much as I can. You'll see the next one is keeping patients safe, and so that's where today's presentation falls under. And then also just to give you an idea there's tons of tools and resources designed for people living with diabetes to support you in self-management. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce you to Lyquen. Lyquen is possibly a friend of yours, or maybe hopefully somebody that is similar to you. And these are the medications she's on. And I've also given them just a little bit more information about her. So when we look at Lyquen and trying to keep her safe and don't let her get sick? Well, the first thing to do is to prevent sickness. So one of the most important things we can do is make sure we get our vaccinations in. So there's the annual influenza vaccination. So that's the annual flu shot. And why do we get it? Because it has been proven to reduce hospitalizations and death. So, really when it comes to caring for ourselves, and we want to do everything we can to prevent and keep us safe, we want to make sure we're getting our annual flu shot. And you can imagine many times you can get that through the primary care provider, you can get it through community clinics, you can get it through community pharmacists. So that's done annually, and you'll see it coming out towards October-ish, actually, the end of October. But certainly if you don't get in right at the middle to the end of October, go for it in November. It's not too late to get your annual flu shot. The other vaccinations that you could consider to help prevent sickness is the pneumonia shot. And there are 2 different pneumonia shots, and I'm going to leave it with making sure that you are aware of the pneumonia vaccination, and you'd want to speak to your healthcare provider about which one is appropriate for you, at what timing is it appropriate for you, because there's certain, if you get one, you have to wait a certain time before you get the other one, and vice versa. But just making you aware of, checking off your check boxes. I know if I want to stay healthy, I need to get my annual flu shot, and I need to get a pneumonia shot that's more generally once or twice in your lifetime. But again, this depends on you and all your different medical conditions and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of it, and you have a conversation with your healthcare provider. And the other vaccination to consider would be the herpes zoster vaccination. So that would be the shingles vaccination. And again, there's actually 2 different ones on the market, and we'd recommend one versus another based on access to resources and so forth. So again, if you don't know about it or if you haven't had it, you'd want to make sure you have a conversation with your healthcare provider as to when is that appropriate for me and which one should I get at that time. Okay, so now that we've considered for Lai-Wen what she can do to help prevent herself from getting sick, the next thing to know is, if you're sick, what can you do to prevent it from actually getting worse? And so I invite you to follow along, use your phones or use your computer or your laptop, and go to guidelines.diabetes.ca. And when you open that website, you'll see on the left-hand side under the drop-down menu, the appendices. And when you open the Appendix 8, the sick day medication list opens. And this one is the one that many healthcare professionals might be familiar with. You'll see on the left-hand side, there's instructions for healthcare professionals, and on the right-hand side, there's some instructions for people with diabetes. I'll bring your attention to the SADMANs. These are the classes of medications that we would recommend that people would hold in the event that they are sick. But truthfully, this tool isn't entirely helpful for people living with diabetes, because how many of us know what classes of the medications there are? So we'll move on to the next slide, and that's the one that's really more designed for people with diabetes. Okay, so this is the tool, and I think what's most important, is that I want you to be able to find this tool, because while this was designed for people affected by diabetes, truthfully, there's a lot of intricacies that go into making this particularly relevant to you. So we want to individualize it. So in many ways, I'm going to walk you through how to find it and then encourage you to print it off and take it with you to your next healthcare provider appointment. So to find that page, to have that in front of you so that you can follow along with me, I welcome you to follow along with use your phone or, again, your laptop or your computer, and go to guidelines.diabetes.ca. And from the home screen, this is what your home screen is going to look like. And you'll see that we are talking about how do we stay safe when we're sick. So that's the middle one. How do we keep patients safe? And after you click on that, the resources for people with diabetes will open, and you'll see the middle one there, staying safe when you have diabetes and are sick or at risk of dehydration, will open. Okay, and so now when we have this open, I'm just going to make it bigger, and you can see from the top part, when you have diabetes or are sick or are sick and at risk of or at risk of dehydration, I think it's first important that we actually recognize what does it mean by to be at risk of dehydration. And so we have, when you're vomiting, when you have diarrhea, if you have fever. So whenever you're fluid depleted, right? If you're feverish, you're kind of sweating a lot, and so you're technically at risk of dehydration. And certainly when you're vomiting and diarrhea, well, you're definitely losing fluids. So what do we do in that situation? Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we are replenishing the fluid we have lost. So certainly there we have drink plenty of fluids. Now it's kind of, we have some caveats built into this resource in that if you have been told to limit your fluids, so if your kidneys are, you have chronic kidney disease on top of diabetes and whatnot, then technically this tool is not for you. And what you can do is use this tool, go to your healthcare provider and find out, what do you mean by, okay, I need to replenish with something, but what should I do? Can you give me more information? And when I say go to your healthcare provider, not every healthcare provider is going to know the answer to that. It might be your nephrologist or your renal dietitian or so forth. But the truth is that if you make a start, go to somebody, go to your healthcare provider, they will either be able to help you themselves or they will direct you to how you can find the help. So that's really what we're saying, is just make sure you know the answer for you, right? Drinking plenty of fluids. And you'll see there's a whole list of different ideas, suggestions. So electrolyte replacement solutions, clear soups or broths, water, diet soda, watered down apple juice. And they're kind of in an order of best, better, and anything's better than nothing kind of thing. And so we really try to, it kind of depends on your level of kidney function, your underlying care. So, if you have, and it also depends on the extent of vomiting and diarrhea that you're going through. So it's not really prescriptive as to this is what you must do, but any of those choices, if possible, if you're really dire, start with the electrolyte replacement solutions and kind of work your way down, as in better, top is the best, first choice, second choice, third choice options. And certainly limiting caffeine is important. Okay, so then don't forget, Lyquen is on glycoside. So for her, I need to make sure that if she cannot eat her usual foods, that I have to give her some suggestions as to what she could have so that she doesn't have low blood sugar. But truthfully, in this case, Lyquen is our patient and she is on glycoside, so then I do have to worry about hypoglycemia. On the other hand, there are several people who actually aren't on medications that can cause lows. And so if you're not on a medication that can cause lows, well then truthfully, this is not really, I don't have to worry about lows for you because you're not on meds that cause lows, right? So what medications cause lows? That would be things like glycoside or glyburide or repaglinide if you're on any of those, or if you're on insulin of any sort. So then if you are, then that's relevant to you. And if you're not on any of those agents that actually can cause lows, then you know what, let's just move on, keep this tool simple, that doesn't pertain to you. So talking about moving on, Lyquen is not on insulin. And so, you know what, I'm going to tell her, if she's in my office, I'm going to tell her, let's not worry about this because you're not on that, let's just go to the next bullet point. And the next bullet point is, if you are eating less than normal and the symptoms last more than 24 hours, you should temporarily stop. In this case, it's her glycoside. And so why we try to give a little bit more information in this tool is that in this case, if she's, if the vomiting and diarrhea is kind of mild and going over several days, but she's actually able to keep eating fine, then technically she can still continue to take her glycoside in that case. I'm going to draw your attention, even though I know we've been talking about Lyquen as our patient, I just want to draw your attention to the fact of if you are using insulin. So she's not using insulin, but you on listening to this webinar, you might be using insulin. So I do want to have a little bit of a conversation here about, for those who are using insulin, you would need to check your blood sugar more often because you are at risk of lows, right? And you might need to adjust the amount of insulin you inject. And so that's a whole conversation that you need to have with your healthcare provider, and you need to know how to adjust your insulin. This tool, we try to keep it simple, and so because there's so many different forms of insulin that people could be on, they could be on the once a day, they could be on the once a day plus mealtime insulin, or they could be on the mixed insulin. So because there's so many different types of insulin, we left it that if you don't know how to adjust your insulin, make sure you speak to your healthcare provider, who should be able to give you the information as to how you should adjust your insulin. And if they don't know, then of course we just ask them to make sure that they can refer you. So if they don't know, then I would be, the next question I'd be like, do you know who would be able to help me answer this question? So that's just all about supporting you in your own self-care. All right, so now if we flip over the tool to page 2, or the back of page 1, this is where I am, and this is hopefully we're together there. So this is a list of the different medications that we would ask you to temporarily stop in the event that you are sick or at risk of dehydration. And one thing you could do is literally go through this and try to find the names of which medications you're on. But truthfully, I'll draw your attention to the bottom where it says note. The list above does not include the names of medications that come in combination. So for example, these are the meds that are single source items. So for example, if you look at certain diabetes pills, there the SGLT2 inhibitors can come single as Invokana, or they can be in combination with metformin, and then it's called Invokamet. Well, that might be simple to sort of get the fact that, oh, I have to stop my Invokamet as well if I happen to be on that agent. But if you're on the combination of Forxiga with metformin, that one, the name becomes Zigduo. So it's not something that is easy for somebody living with diabetes to figure out all the different intricacies. Similarly, Jardiance, when you put it in combination with metformin, the name becomes Synjardy. So again, tricky. The other ones that we also need to consider are the ones that have metformin in combination with a DPP-4 inhibitor. So for example, some people are on Januvia. Well, that's not on the list. And if you were on Januvia, you could actually continue Januvia in the event that you were at risk of dehydration. But Januvia, if it was mixed with metformin, you'd have the name of the medication be Janumet. So Janumet you'd want to consider holding in the event that you have dehydration. And similarly, we have Gentadueto or Comboglize, and those are different agents that are all in combination with metformin. So again, there's a little bit of intricacies that we have to think about. So that brings us down to, who do we ask for help? So while this tool does say ask your pharmacist, and the idea behind that is that many times medications are changing all the time, and so pharmacists being easily accessible, that's one person you could ask. But really and truly, ask any healthcare provider, because we want to make sure that this list is provided to you, but what does that mean to you? So in this case, if we can actually think about Lai Quen, if I was filling this out for her, I would be telling her that the medications that she needs to temporarily stop when she's eating less than normal would be gliclazide, right? Now, mind you, I have to emphasize, it's only if she's eating less than normal. So technically, if she's able to continue eating the same amount that she normally would, then she can continue. If she's keeping things down, it's not all vomiting and coming up or going straight through her, then really she is fine to stay on her gliclazide. When she is at risk of dehydration, or when she can't keep, when she's fluid and so forth, vomiting and stuff, then for her, it would be metformin, canagliflozin, and the telmisartan, or, we might actually write it out in the form that she might be familiar with it, which would be, I guess, in that case, metformin, Invokana, and the telmisartan. And then, we'd always want to have the date that it was reviewed and who reviewed it with you, just so that when you go from one healthcare provider to another, everybody's speaking the same language, and everybody knows what you're on, or when that information was updated. The other thing I'd like to point out is the other part underneath. It says, note, restart these medications when you are eating and drinking normally. And that's an actually very important part, because, so for example, in this case, Lai Quen is on telmisartan, and there are several people this happens to, where you have an incident, maybe you come down with pneumonia or some sort of thing, you end up in the hospital because your kidneys have had some complications and they kind of were affected. due to the dehydration of the pneumonia and so forth. But then what happens is in the hospital, we stop it because that's what we want. That's on the list. That's that's the right thing to do. But once the kidney function normalizes, there should be a conversation about when do we restart. And so for some people, it's, this is done not even in a hospital setting. You actually stop it for 2 or 3 days and then you restart it. No problem. But I think that it's a worthwhile conversation to have with your healthcare professional if telmisartan or whatnot is actually indicated for you for protecting your heart and your kidneys. So in long term, it actually protects your kidneys, right? If it's there to protect your heart and kidneys and is indicated for you, we don't stop it for the rest of your life if it was only a short term needing to protect your kidneys for short term. So I hope that makes sense, that we want to make sure that the conversation, if you had stopped it short term for in the event that you were sick, the conversation should be had as to when do you restart it. And the last thing that is important about this tool is the very bottom part that tells you when should you seek additional help. So for example, when is this tool not enough for you to support you in self-care, right? So for example, if you cannot drink enough fluids, right? So the very first part says, I'm dehydrated, I need to drink fluids. But if for whatever reason, maybe you've been told you're not supposed to drink so many fluids, or maybe you're drinking, but it's just still going straight through and you can't seem to keep it down. This tool, you need to seek more help, right? If you don't know which medications to stop, even though they're there, you can see it's still pretty complicated. So if this list does not make sense to you, go to your health and engage your healthcare team and find out which medications should I need to stop, and I need to understand this tool, right? If I don't know how to adjust my insulin, again, I need to seek help. So again, this just kind of gives you an idea of the fact that it's not enough. Okay, so that concludes the first part of the webinar, which really just walks people through how this tool can be used for you. The second part of the webinar was really the thought process that went into designing this tool, and it's a little bit more advanced, but it might be relevant to you or for you to appreciate why we made certain decisions and how we wrote certain things. So when we created this tool, we really had to, the committee had to say to ourselves, well, really, what are we worried about when people are sick? What's the point of, what are the issues that we have to think of? And so I welcome you to pause this video, read through those, and see if any of that makes sense to you, and see if any of that, if you know which is the answer, which is the best response as to which is the most true. And so let's see, if you've paused it, you'll see that the answers are that the first one, patients are at risk of hypoglycemia when they cannot eat or drink sufficiently. Well, I kind of shaded that because that's half true. So the one that's most true is the third comment, the third line down, which is patients are at risk of acute kidney injury due to dehydration and impaired blood flow to the kidneys. So truthfully, there are other risk factors that put us at risk of acute kidney injury. Certainly the infection itself puts us at acute kidney injury, so that's one of the risk factors, and so that's why it's important to have vaccinations to help prevent getting sick. There's other things like if you have underlying chronic kidney disease, there's other things that put us at risk of acute kidney injury. But with respect to these 4 different statements, which one is the most correct? Well, when we are sick, we are worried about the hydration status and maintaining the blood flow to the kidneys. So let's go over each different statement and try to make it correct. Try to understand what do we need to make it correct and how did we develop the tool to address these things. So the first one, patients are at risk of hypoglycemia when they cannot eat or drink sufficiently. And to make that more correct, we really need to recognize if they are at risk of hypoglycemia. So truthfully, patients are at risk of hypoglycemia when they cannot eat or drink sufficiently if they are on medications associated with hypoglycemia. The reverse, therefore, if they're not on medications that are associated with hypoglycemia, then they're not technically at risk of hypoglycemia. And truthfully, I wouldn't even worry about the risk of hypoglycemia in somebody who's not on medications associated with hypoglycemia. I would just move on to the next part, the next statement. So let's just take a minute and review which medications are associated with hypoglycemia, who has a higher risk of hypoglycemia, and those are people who are on either glycoside, such as Lyquan is, or glyburide, right? So the sulfonylurea, such as that. Insulin of generally any sort, so whether it's the long-acting insulin or whether it's the mealtime insulin, both of those, or whether you're on a mixed insulin, insulin of any sort puts you at higher risk of hypoglycemia. And then, of course, we also have rarely, but it's possible or less, it's the nicotinamide known as repaglinide, which we would have told you to stop anyway, because remember how they often tell you, no, if you're not eating, don't need to take it. So that's probably less. But having said that, certainly if you're not on any of those agents that I just listed, the glycoside, glyburide, or any form of insulin, then really, we're not really at risk of hypoglycemia. And I'm quite honestly more concerned about the hyperglycemia, the high blood sugars, which we'll talk about. Our second statement does address that. Patients are at risk of hyperglycemia, so high blood sugars, due to the decreased counter-regulatory hormone release during sickness. So let's look at what's wrong with this. Well, it's not that it's a decreased counter-regulatory hormone release, but rather an increased counter-regulatory hormone release. So let's try to understand what that means. Certainly, the counter-regulatory hormone release is another way of just calling it stress hormones. So when you're sick, you have stress hormones released, and that kind of makes sense. Just sort of think about it. When you're not feeling well, when you're sick and you're under stress. You know, you're not feeling well. You're vomiting, you have diarrhea. You're under so much stress that your sugars actually go up due to that stress hormone release. And so that kind of also explains why is it that when you're sick and you're actually not even eating as much because you're just not feeling like you want to eat, but your sugars are going up, and you say, what's going on? I'm not even eating as much and my sugars are going up. And that is because of that stress hormone release that is increased, which causes your sugar to go up. And so that factors into our main concern about, I'm only worried about hypoglycemia, lows, if they're on medications that can cause lows. For the most part, I'm actually really worried about the sugars that are going up that we need to control. We need to take care of that. Okay, and so when it comes to this, the third statement, well, we've already said that it is correct, right? We've already said that patients are at risk of acute kidney injury due to dehydration and impaired blood flow to the kidneys. But what does this mean? So essentially, when you're sick, when we were thinking about the tool, well, to counter the risk of dehydration, the first thing we tell you to do is drink plenty of fluids, and that certainly was the first thing on the tool, right? The other thing we would tell you is to hold or temporarily stop your diuretic. That's the water pill, right? Because the water pill is causing you to become dehydrated. It's causing you to pee out liquid, right, or fluid, or urinate. So we try to mitigate, we try to slow down or try to prevent or reduce the dehydration by saying, you know what, we don't need to take this diuretic right now for these next couple of days until we can reestablish our balance in our bodies. The other one we'll tell you to hold is your SGLT2 receptor inhibitors. So those are the sodium glucose lowering transport inhibitors. But regardless, it's on the list, but that's what we're doing. That's how we're countering the dehydration when we created the tool. The other thing we're doing is we're actually trying to mitigate or reduce the impaired blood flow to the kidneys. And so how do we do that? Well, again, the diuretic is slowing down or causing dehydration and reducing the blood flow to the kidneys. So we, again, hold that. And then the other agents which also affect blood flow to the kidneys are NSAIDs. And again, the list is on that tool, so you can look at the different NSAIDs. We also tell you to stop or hold the ACE or ARBs and stop the SGLT2 inhibitors. Now, I just wanted to explain one thing, because many of you may be on an ACE or an ARB, and you were told you need to take these because these are going to help protect your kidneys. And so if we just look at that, almost screenshot it, you go, whoa, why am I stopping these two agents that actually can cause impaired blood flow to the kidneys? And I just wanted to explain that to you. Okay, so just a little bit understand what's happening is the kidneys have a pressure inside the kidneys, and we want it to be green. Green is good, right? But what happens over time, just like blood pressure goes up, well, the glomerular pressure, the pressure in the kidneys, can slightly go up. And so what we do is we put you on agents, so the ACEs and the ARBs and the SGLT2 class. We actually tell people, oh, let's put you on these, and that's going to reduce the glomerular pressure and hopefully bring us back into the green. The nice green is good, right? But what can happen in acute kidney injury or an acute illness, so it's this situation where either you've had a heart attack or some sort of illness like the pneumonia, that puts pressure on the kidneys. And when the kidney pressure goes down, well, we don't want you to be on those agents that are further lowering pressure. And so to protect the kidneys in that state, we just stop them temporarily. Okay, and then looking at the last statement, let's try to understand that. So I'm going to just move it up so we have a little bit of working room. Patients are at risk of DKA, and I've crossed that part out because that part is the part that's wrong. So let's just discuss this a little bit. Patients are at risk of DKA. Well, let's just think about it, because everybody here on the webinar, is everybody at risk of DKA? And that's not entirely true. So again, it's just kind of like the same kind of thing. Are you all at risk of hypoglycemia? Not entirely. And so we need to know who's at risk of DKA, who do we need to be a little bit more cautious about, and who can we just say, you know what, move on. You're not at risk of DKA. Let's just not exaggerate things and make things worse than they really are. It doesn't pertain to you. So let's take a look at who is at risk of DKA. So what is DKA due to? Well, DKA is, and you see I crossed off due to ongoing basal insulin because that's not correct. What is the correct statement? People who are at risk of DKA, it's due to a relative insulin deficiency in comparison to an elevated stress hormone release. So again, what we have is, it's always our body is supposed to be in balance, right? The amount of insulin is supposed to be related to our stress hormones and everything's supposed to flow nicely. Well, sometimes when we're sick, we have issues where the gap between the amount of insulin we have in our bodies is too low in comparison to the stress hormone release. So the stress hormones are going up, right? Remember we talked about that? They're going up because we're sick. So we actually want to make sure we are maintaining our insulin. And so that's why some people will say, well, I'm sick and I'm not eating as much. Why do I still need the same amount of insulin, or, that type of thing? And so it's because the stress hormones are causing your sugars to go up. We need to make sure your insulin is not, down at zero, but we have to make sure that it's countering and balancing as much as possible. And so many times that's why we actually keep you on the insulin and we don't stop the insulin, right? The other thing to think about is, again, who's at risk? So therefore, who's at risk of DKA are the people who have lived with diabetes for longer. So don't forget, Lyquan has lived with diabetes for 25 years. So she's really kind of, her insulin production may have been reduced kind of down, and as we get lower and lower, her ability to produce insulin is lower. So that's a thought about, wow, could her gap of insulin production to stress hormone release be wider? And quite possibly, yes, that's something I'm thinking about in the back of my head, right? People who use insulin, well, they are needing the support of insulin. So of course they are at higher risk of DKA. And particularly when we're thinking about type 2 diabetes, if you're on an SGLT2, so don't forget, Lyquan she is on an SGLT2 inhibitor. So she may have exhibiting signs of DKA possibly at lower than expected blood sugar levels. And so that's just something to consider, because many times we used to think, oh, well, their sugars aren't elevated, she can't be in DKA. But it's something to consider. And it's not always lower than expected. Sometimes it is still at the 14s and 16s and higher that we would expect to see DKA in. DKA is very complicated. As a caveat, it looks different in type 1 and type 2 often. So having said that, it's just something to think about when we are creating the tool, if you're at risk, and what would you do to mitigate the risk of DKA? Well, certainly it's the replenishing of fluid, staying hydrated, which in this case, because they're at risk of DKA, if you really are at risk of DKA, the more important ones, remember I started saying that in order of importance would be electrolyte replacement solutions. They are even more important for somebody who's at risk of DKA versus just water, right? Similarly, what's the other thing we'll do is we'll make sure we actually don't stop the insulin, and we'll be making sure we're checking sugars as well as ketones, and we'll be making sure those people who are at risk of DKA are given a proper insulin adjustment chart based on the presence of ketones. So again, that's something that if you don't know how to do, nobody's actually gone over that with you, that's a conversation you'd want to have. Maybe asking your healthcare provider, am I at risk of DKA? And if so, okay, and so this is a summary slide that just corrects all of the bullet points. But again, remembering that not everybody is at risk of hypoglycemia and not everybody is at risk of DKA. So the two ones in the middle are more relevant to everybody, and the other ones on the extremes, the number 1 and number 4, are kind of more knowing. You want to know your risks. Okay, so that concludes our webinar on staying safe while sick. I thank you very much for joining me. I thank you for helping me care for Lyquen. And I hope that this has engaged you and empowered you to care for yourself and to get you to know what you need to do to stay safe while you're sick, which pretty much means if you don't know all the answers to that particular tool that we discussed, print it off, take it to your healthcare provider, and hopefully it'll all make sense once you're actually speaking with somebody to help support you in your own care. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to Jen.
And that concludes our webinar for today. I'd like to sincerely thank Susie for speaking on behalf of Diabetes Canada. It has been a great learning experience. And for those of you looking for more support and resources for living well with diabetes, please feel free to call our toll-free line at 1-800-BANTING. So that's 1-800-226-8464. If you have any questions about today's presentation, please send us an email at webinars@diabetes.ca, and we will be getting back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you've enjoyed learning with Diabetes Canada and look forward to your participation in the future.